In September of 2019, I delivered a TED Talk that discussed the impact of technology on Generation Z and their values. And one of the specific values that I focused on was truth, and how in the 21st century, where technology provides a platform for everyone's opinion to gain traction, we've entered what the Oxford Dictionary has dubbed the post-truth era. And right in theme with the amplification of everyone's voices, the summer after that academic year, my TED Talk had gone viral, garnering over 200,000 views. And suddenly, I had begun receiving 20, 30, 40 Instagram DMs from strangers who expressed their own personal thoughts on the impact of technology on Generation Z's values. And one particular message stood out to me. This person expressed their belief that misinformation was the byproduct of an incredibly positive phenomenon, which was the fact that there was now a space for everyone's voices to be heard. He thought it was great that there was social media that would allow for all kinds of opinions to be amplified. That way, he thought, people could be exposed to all the possible ideas before deciding for themselves which ones they would adopt. And I thought, what an optimistic way to think about misinformation. Was such productive exposure even feasible on social media? And so these questions sparked an interest in the root causes and ramifications of misinformation, specifically as they pertain to social media. And under the guidance of Dr. McClelland at the Cambridge Center of International Research, I started investigating the philosophy of misinformation. I eventually found that there was quite a surprising parallel between the opinion of this stranger and philosopher J.S. Mill's marketplace of ideas theory. So in Mill's theory, the absence of censorship allows for individuals to partake in a recurring evaluation of all the ideas available in the marketplace, requiring them to consistently re-examine their opinions because they are constantly exposed to new ones. And ultimately, the hope is that this prevents one's belief from declining into dogma. In many regards, the Millian marketplace of ideas echoes the capitalist free market economy, where the best ideas, like the best products, become successful and gain popularity, and the false or illogical ideas get crowded out. And so this is the social media ideal, and I use this as a conceptual framework for my research. But again, the key question was, is social media and the Millian marketplace of ideas truly compatible? Is it possible to have a productive, censor-free social media that is conducive to productive discourse? My research allowed me to recognize that our conversations about misinformation tend to blur two distinct phenomena: EcoChambers and epistemic bubbles. Whilst members of epistemic bubbles simply lack exposure to all of the ideas, members of EcoChambers are in fact exposed to all conflicting beliefs, but actively distrust and reject them. And so EcoChambers are the most dangerous because it requires the formation of trust. So as I mentioned, the Millian marketplace of ideas was based on the presumption that the false and immoral ideas would fail to gain traction. Social media, however, has a tendency to do the opposite, with the sensationalist, fabricated stories going viral. Studies of Twitter feeds have shown that false stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true ones are. And this is due to the phenomenon of epistemic bubbles and echo chambers. So let's start with epistemic bubbles. Epistemic bubbles, they form because social media platforms are run by profit-seeking companies whose business model relies on user engagement as opposed to truth. In order to maximize ad revenue, it is in the interest of social media companies to create worthwhile communities that are based on engagement, but not necessarily facts. So Facebook, for example, boosts user engagement by providing the option to join both public and private groups, allowing for like-minded individuals to gather and share information. And this can be incredibly problematic, as evidenced by the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where it was found that 64% of all extremist group joins are joining because of groups you should join and discover algorithms provided by Facebook. And so groups that share like-minded information use Facebook as intermediaries to share knowledge and exchange judgments that reinforce their pre-existing ideas. And this is clearly in tension with the Millian ideal. How can one vigorously and earnestly debate anything if they are not exposed to all the ideas in the marketplace? This is due to the epistemic bubble. and thus some kind of intervention or solution is required. Echo chambers contradict the million ideal even further because of two reasons. First, the fast food nature of social media, and second, the viral tendencies of misinformation. Apps like Twitter limit the productive debate the mill required to 280 characters, meaning that one must take a definite stance to even fit within the confines of the character count. And this prevents users from fully conveying and understanding all the ideas in the marketplace. As I've mentioned, the viral nature of misinformation even furthers the presence of echo chambers on social media, where multifaceted and complex issues are dichotomized and oversimplified. As such, the million ideal is also incompatible with echo chambers, and a different solution must be implemented. And this leads me to the crux of my research. I considered existing solutions that are used to mitigate misinformation. So currently, social media flags incorrect and misleading content. And these interventions are used to warn and protect users from misinformation with signs that dispute the validity of the information displayed. So for instance, according to Facebook, once a post is flagged as false or incorrect, its impressions fall by 80%, which works to place a kind of damper on misinformation. But the problem is that flagging misinformation takes 3 days, and content on Facebook tends to go viral for 1 day before being out-sensationalized by the next big outrage. So a more efficient and preventative approach must be considered. The next solution is philosopher Regina Rini's reputational scores. This solution works to track the veracity of the stories that users post and repost by using independent fact-checkers to observe whether users are reposting contested stories. And so from there, it's computationally simple to calculate a score based upon the frequency with which they repost disputed stories. And once a user has a score, a colored icon appears next to the name, indicating how reputable the content that they typically post is. Over time, Rini postulates, ambiguous testimonial norms would be substituted by a convention that expects sincere endorsement from users when they share information. But this solution would not only result in the alienation of users in echo chambers, but it fundamentally contradicts the financial goals of these social media companies, as alienation results in decreased engagement, which undermines their profits. So a more feasible solution should be considered. And this brings us to my proposed solution. Just as drivers must obtain driver's license to maximize the safety for all the drivers on the road, I propose an educational prerequisite that would ameliorate the global deficit in media literacy, ultimately making social media a more safe and reliable environment for all of its users. If the post-truth era has taught us anything, it's that the risks of not requiring users to educate themselves as to how to engage on social media is far too great to dismiss and would result in conspiracy theories and exacerbate political polarization. So logistically speaking, users would be required to engage in a short media literacy informational module that discusses proper social media etiquette. Short videos would encourage critical thinking and corroborating stories. So for example, users would look at examples of other users who've misused their social media and defied the norms of accountability. While the hope is that this educational solution would be implemented globally by social media platforms, some countries have begun implementing it on a national level, including Sweden's News Evaluator project. Here, in schools, pupils assess the trustworthiness of different sources and information presented based on how the same story is presented by other broadcasting channels. So by requiring all people to partake in this prerequisite, you create a herd immunity effect, so that even if some users misuse the platform, most would recognize a breach of conduct and the overall spread of misinformation would be mitigated. Given the rising tide of pressure on social media companies to better tackle the rising misinformation and fake news, implementing this measure would be a way in which they could regulate themselves and thus avoid government intervention. This would not immediately perfect the environment on social media, but it would, over time, improve the current status quo. More importantly, it would facilitate the application of the million ideal, enabling the marketplace of ideas to be implemented and used as a way to spur creativity, prompt ideas, and catalyze social media as an agent for positive change. Thank you. I'm now open to any questions if you guys have any.
I guess, hopefully everyone can hear me. It's recently come out that a lot of fact checkers for companies like Facebook, now known as Meta and whatnot, aren't necessarily objective fact checkers, but actually a lot of their fact checking can be opinionated. And on top of that, I'm going to go quite far back to an extreme example, but in Jim Crow era, there were supposedly educational exams that a lot of people would have to take before they could vote, which were designed to be prejudiced against the black community to prevent them from voting. So if a social media company can control, I suppose, who's checking the facts and what education someone needs to be doing before they're allowed to use their service, does that not then set a dangerous precedent for limiting who has access to be able to share their opinions? And in an extreme example, does that not set a dangerous precedent for who is allowed to then vote or engage in different democratic processes based on their education levels?
Sure. So just to reiterate the question for those who may not have been able to hear, essentially, if we are relying on independent fact checkers to look and kind of prepare that educational prerequisite for social media, how can we ensure that those independent fact checkers, given that they are the ones providing that education, are reliable and don't further inequalities? And I think that that's a great question, because that's kind of the logistical issue. What I wanted to do with my solution is ensure that this isn't done on a government national level, because that would allow for biases of all kinds to seep in, whether it's geographic or otherwise. And so the idea was, since platforms such as Facebook and Instagram have such a global reach, the educational kind of component would be designed by them. And the hope is, yes, many of these companies are based in America, but I think the idea is that the independent fact checkers are in a separate realm to the government and the kind of private or national institutions that are being used to kind of disseminate education. So hopefully we can rely on those independent fact checkers to provide a basic educational foundation that simply doesn't teach users what's right and what's wrong, or what to believe and what not to believe, but simply teaches them how to think critically. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
The question is, how complex would this education system be? Because if it's too simple, it stands to reason people simply go through it and behave as they normally would on social media. But if it's too complex, would it not show the profit of the company because no one would want to go through that?
No, absolutely. And I think it's getting that fine line between the two extremes, I would say. The idea is that just as you accept terms and conditions to have them, observe what you're looking at and cookies, I think the idea is that users would simply be required to, watch an educational video that they'd have to watch the whole way through, or answer questions, or look at examples and determine whether it is valid or invalid, whether it's photoshopped or not. And so it would simply kind of inculcate in users a more critical eye for the information that they're looking at. And so the idea is that, it would be simply just like when you download the platform, you kind of look at it, you engage in whatever education they're providing. And to incentivize these companies, the government could subsidize them, or find another way to be involved without actually affecting the content that these companies are sharing. I'll take one more question. Yeah.
How would this educational prerequisite be decided on an international level, considering that different national biases, different national preferences, and all those different things?
Yeah, that's one of the big concerns, right? So the hope is that this kind of transcends geographic limitations, and it allows for global companies such as Facebook or TikTok or whatever it may be to kind of take charge of that educational component, perhaps with the assistance of government, but without letting kind of national biases or cultural norms infiltrate or affect the education that's being provided. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate the support, and I hope this was a valuable presentation.